I never thought my life would turn into the kind of story strangers whisper about online, but here I am. My husband, the man I built my life with, the father of my child, the man who once swore he'd never let anything come between us, decided to destroy me in front of everyone I loved. He chose the worst possible moment to do it. At our daughter's graduation, a day that should have been hers. A day I thought would be filled with pride, tears, and family photographs. Instead, it became a performance of betrayal. He stood there, with that smug look plastered across his face, and announced he was leaving me. Loud enough for our family, for friends, for the entire hall to hear. I can still feel the air collapse in my chest, the sound of laughter and applause choking into whispers. My daughter's smile vanished. My world shattered, but here's the part he didn't expect. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I didn't plead with him like he wanted me to, because by then, I already knew the truth. I knew about the lies. I knew about the betrayal. And I knew that the man I once loved had signed his own sentence the moment he decided to humiliate me. What he didn't realize was that his public humiliation was the spark I needed. The thing that pulled me out of despair and turned me into something he should have feared all along, Dot. So when he started screaming weeks later, clutching his face, his reputation crumbling, his entire world turning into the same nightmare he thought he'd put me through, I didn't feel pity, felt justice. Dot. This is the story of how betrayal turned me into something sharper than grief, something stronger than heartbreak. And why my husband will never forget the day he chose to ruin me, because that was the day I decided to ruin him back. I grew up believing that family was sacred. My parents drilled it into me. Marriage is forever. Loyalty is everything. So when I met David in college, I clung to that idea like it was scripture. He was charming in that way that makes you feel like the only person in the room. He had the kind of confidence that could silence anyone, a laugh that drew people in, and a way of speaking that convinced you he knew exactly what he wanted in life. I was 20, too young to understand that confidence without kindness is just arrogance dressed up in a suit. We married 3 years later. I was in love. My parents were proud. His parents, well, they smiled, but I always felt the undercurrent. Especially his mother, Margaret, my mother-in-law, was the type of woman who could slice you open with nothing but a compliment. "Oh, you look lovely, dear. Though I suppose with your frame, you'd never pull off the dress I wore at your wedding." Or, "Your cooking is good, sweetie." Of course, David's always preferred my seasoning, but he'll adjust. She said these things with her lips curled into what others thought was a smile. I learned to swallow it. For years, I told myself it wasn't worth making a scene. David? He never defended me. Not once. If I tried to bring it up later, he'd brush it off. "Babe, that's just how Mom is. Don't take it so seriously." At first, I convinced myself it wasn't serious. I had bigger things to focus on. My daughter, Lily. She was the joy of my life. The reason I could tolerate all the little humiliations. From the day she was born, she was light. Big brown eyes, curls she inherited from me, and a sharpness to her mind that terrified and amazed me all at once. But even Lily became a battlefield. Margaret liked to swoop in, correcting the way I dressed her, the food I fed her, the way I raised her. And David? He stood by silently, as though his mother's word outweighed mine. The cracks widened as years passed. When David got his promotion at the firm, I thought maybe it would change things. We could finally move out of the cramped townhouse and into a home where Lily could have her own backyard. Instead, David insisted we move closer to his parents. He said it made sense. They could help with Lily, we'd save money, and Margaret knew all the best schools in the district. I should have fought harder. Instead, I let him win. We moved into a house just 3 streets away from Margaret and Harold. That was when things shifted from small cuts to deep wounds. Margaret treated Lily like her own daughter, not her granddaughter. She enrolled her in classes without asking me. She made decisions about her birthday parties. She even called herself Mama sometimes, laughing it off as a joke. I confronted David about it once, trembling with rage. She is taking over my role as Lily's mother. Can't you see that? He sighed, rubbed his temples like I was exhausting him. You're overreacting. Mom just loves Lily. What's wrong with that? What was wrong was that my daughter started slipping through my fingers. She began asking Grandma for permission instead of me. She'd run to Margaret when she was hurt, when she was proud, when she wanted comfort. And every time I saw it, I felt a piece of myself dying. David didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't care. He was too wrapped up in work, in his new lifestyle, in the image he was building for himself. He was climbing the social ladder, and his mother was always there, guiding his every step like he was still a little boy. When my parents visited, the tension was unbearable. My mother would pull me aside, whispering, "He doesn't respect you, sweetheart. This isn't what marriage should look like." I'd nod, but what was I supposed to do? Divorce was shameful in my family. I told myself things would get better. They didn't. The first real fracture came when we had a dispute about money. David had started earning more than I ever imagined, but somehow I never saw much of it. He controlled the accounts, the bills, the savings. I had an allowance, his word, not mine. If I needed money for something extra, I had to ask Dot, do you know how humiliating it is to ask your husband, the man you've built a life with, for money like you're a child begging for candy? I tried to resist. I tried to remind him that we were supposed to be a partnership. He laughed, actually laughed in my face. Sweetheart, you wouldn't understand the finances. Just let me handle it. It's better this way. And then Margaret chimed in, her voice dripping with faux concern. Don't pressure him, dear. Men are simply better at these things. It's in their nature. I wanted to scream, but Lily was in the room, and I didn't want her to see me break. The slow burn humiliation stretched on for years. Margaret's influence only grew. David's arrogance hardened. And Lily, my sweet Lily, was caught in the middle dot by the time she reached her senior year of high school. The distance between us was unbearable. She still loved me, I knew that, but she trusted her father and grandmother more. I could feel myself being erased from her life, and no one seemed to notice but me every night. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made a mistake in marrying David, wondering if I was strong enough to leave. But the thought of tearing Lily's world apart kept me trapped. I convinced myself that enduring was better than destroying, but endurance has a breaking point. Mine came slowly, in little moments. The way David dismissed me in front of friends. The way Margaret made backhanded comments at every holiday dinner. The way Lily, unknowingly, echoed their dismissive tone toward me. It was like being erased, piece by piece, until I was nothing more than a shadow in my own home. And then, on the day of my daughter's graduation, everything finally shattered. The day of Lily's graduation should have been the proudest day of my life. I woke up early, ironing her gown, making sure the little cap fit perfectly on her curls. She looked beautiful, radiant, like all the struggle and pain I'd endured was worth it just for this moment. My baby girl had grown into a woman. I told myself I wouldn't cry. Of course, I cried anyway. David barely looked at me that morning. He was too busy adjusting his tie in the mirror, spraying cologne, fussing with his hair like it was his big day instead of hers. Margaret and Harold were waiting outside when we left. Margaret with her ever-present camera and fake smile. The auditorium was filled with proud families. The air buzzed with excitement, applause, laughter. I tried to hold on to that feeling. For once, I wanted this day to belong to Lily, just her, But David had other plans. When her name was called, when she crossed the stage with that bright smile, I felt my chest swell. The audience clapped, and Margaret cried dramatically, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. I clapped until my hands stung. I thought, finally, a moment untouched by bitterness. I was wrong. After the ceremony, while everyone gathered outside for photos, David cleared his throat. His voice carried, strong and deliberate. "Everyone, I have an announcement." I froze. That tone, I knew it. He loved the spotlight, loved attention, loved being the center of every story. But I didn't expect what came next. I wanted to share this here, in front of family and friends, because it's important. I've decided to end my marriage. I'm leaving her. Silence fell like a guillotine. I heard gasps. Whispers. The click of Margaret's camera stopped mid-frame. My daughter turned, her face draining of color, her smile collapsing. I felt the ground tilt beneath me. I tried to breathe, but my lungs refused. My ears buzzed. Every eye turned toward me, searching for my reaction, waiting for the breakdown. David didn't stop. He thrived in the silence. "It's been coming for a long time," he continued, shaking his head like he was the victim. "I can't pretend anymore. She isn't the woman I married. She hasn't supported me, hasn't grown with me. We've drifted apart." The humiliation burned hotter than fire. He wasn't just leaving me. He was rewriting the story, painting me as a dead weight. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something at him, to claw that smug expression off his face. Instead, I stood frozen, my hands clenched so tight my nails cut into my palms. Margaret stepped forward, placing her hand on David's shoulder like she'd rehearsed this moment with him. "Sometimes it's best to move on," she said softly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "We'll support you, darling." That was it. The script. The performance. They planned this. My betrayal wasn't an accident. It was orchestrated. Lily's eyes filled with tears as she looked between us. "Dad, what are you doing?" Her voice cracked, but he ignored her. Cameras clicked again. Not from Margaret this time, but from strangers, parents, classmates, capturing my humiliation like it was part of the ceremony. I felt stripped bare, shattered, but I refused to give him what he wanted, a seeing dot, so I stood tall. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I whispered, "Congratulations, David. You finally got your spotlight." Then I walked away, inside. Though I was breaking, the days that followed were a blur of whispers, paperwork, and betrayal layered on betrayal. David didn't just leave. He gutted me. I discovered accounts had been drained. He'd been moving money for months, setting up investments in his name only, tying everything back to his parents. My allowance, that humiliating stipend, had been a leash. He'd already cut me off from everything else, our house. Not really ours. His name was on the deed. His lawyer sent me notice within days, informing me I had 60 days to vacate. Lily stayed quiet, torn between parents. She wanted to comfort me. I could see it in her eyes, but David and Margaret whispered poison in her ears. They told her I was unstable, too emotional, too weak, that I couldn't provide for her the way they could. The night I found the emails was the night I stopped being a victim. I logged into the family laptop, the one Lily sometimes used for homework. David's account was still open. I found everything, the receipts for the hotel rooms, the credit card charges for jewelry I never received, the emails between him and his new woman. Her name was Jessica. Younger, of course. A coworker. The kind of woman who looked at him the way I used to. Before I learned what kind of man he truly was, the emails were worse than the betrayal itself. He bragged about me, about how easy it was to keep me quiet, about how she never fight back, she's too broken. That was when something in me hardened. I didn't scream. I didn't confront him. I printed everything, tucked it away in a folder, and started listening, watching, waiting. I noticed patterns. The way Margaret always hovered, the way David always called her before making decisions, the way their voices lowered when I entered the room, the way Lily was slowly being turned against me, one carefully crafted lie at a time. They thought they were erasing me. They thought I'd fade quietly, humiliated and forgotten, but they didn't understand what happens when you push someone too far. One evening, after Lily had gone to bed, David came by to collect more of his things. He was casual, almost cheerful, whistling as he packed. "You'll be fine," he said offhandedly, not even looking at me. "You'll land on your feet. Maybe find someone more on your level." I stared at him. "On my level?" He smirked. "Come on. We both know you've been holding me back. I've outgrown this marriage. Jessica understands me. She's ambitious. She'd be a better example for Lily." That was the final knife. Not just betraying me, but trying to replace me in my daughter's life. I wanted to lunge at him, but instead I smiled. "Good luck with that, David." He looked confused, but shrugged it off. He left whistling. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the folder of evidence. My hands shook, but my mind was clear for the first time in years. They thought I was weak. They thought I was finished, but I wasn't broken. Not anymore. I was sharpening myself, quietly, patiently. And when the time came, they would learn what it feels like to be humiliated, to be stripped bare, to scream in front of everyone you've ever wanted to impress. That night, in the silence of my kitchen, I vowed revenge, not loud. Not theatrical, silent, sharp, absolute. And I promised myself one thing. When it came, it wouldn't just be David who paid, it would be Margaret too. After that night at the kitchen table, everything changed. My days acquired a new rhythm, not the frantic, pleading pace of someone begging to be seen, but the tight, precise cadence of a person with a purpose. I stopped reacting. I started building. I had the facts. I had the receipts, the emails, the dates. I had the witnesses if I needed them, and I had one weapon they never suspected: time. They thought silence meant submission. I turned that into strategy. First, I rewired the narrative. If David and Margaret had rehearsed a public performance, I would write the sequel, quietly, legally, publicly, not by lies or tricks, but by showing the world what they already were. Truth, dressed up as evidence, is cruelty in slow motion. I began with the practical things. I opened my own account. It felt ridiculous at first, like a child taking their first step. But that account became a ledger of dignity. I saved every odd dollar here and there. I cataloged the unkindnesses. I indexed the emails. I labeled the charges: June 12th, dinner at Hotel Montclair, Jessica. July 3rd, Rolex for future ex-wife. It was obsessive. It needed to be obsessive. The pattern needed to be undeniable. Then I reached out to people I'd ignored for years because pride or shame told me not to. Old friends, neighbors, the woman who ran Lily's drama club, a former colleague who'd once admired my tenacity. I spoke to them not as victims do, pleading and raw, but as a collector does, precise and controlled. I asked questions. I listened. I recorded names, times, small corroborations. The little confirmations felt like adding stones to a foundation. I hired a lawyer, someone discreet, with a reputation for quietly dismantling household myths. I wasn't doing this for money anymore. I did it so that every move David made could be challenged. I wanted discovery. I wanted subpoenas. I wanted depositions where his suave voice would have to answer under oath. The law can be a slow blade. I wanted it drawn. While the legal wheels turned, I worked on the social side. Public opinion mattered to David. He curated an image of success. So I set small traps inside that image. I arranged for casual meetings that were never casual. I let people overhear conversations. I made sure there were traces, an offhand remark in the break room, a forwarded email with the wrong subject line that hinted at something more, a receipt that landed in the inbox of someone who mattered. Nothing illegal, nothing that put me in the wrong. Just the exact right amount of inconvenient truth. There were losses. There were nights when the plan stalled. Lily would call and ask awkward questions. "Mom, why are we doing this?" She'd whisper. Guilt would cut into me like cold glass. I'd fold down, breathe, and tell myself I was doing it for her. For the daughter who deserved parents not to be actors in a farce, there were small victories that tasted like vindication. A colleague of David's, whom I'd subtly befriended through coffee and casual empathy, mentioned in passing that the firm had been having whispers about a partner's extramarital distractions. A distant cousin of Margaret's called to say she'd heard family tales of favoritism and manipulation. A bank clerk, the kind of person who sees everything, passed on a detail about a wire transfer that didn't add up. These crumbs were my map dot. I started to plant seeds in public places. Not lies, not traps that would hurt me later. I posted a few careful, mundane updates on social media, Lily's old school photos, a throwback to a recital where I'd been the one applauding in the front row. Nothing to attract suspicion, just enough to remind people I existed on my own terms. It was petty, maybe, but it felt like drawing lines in the sand. I was not invisible dot, and then, because life loves irony, the supernatural whisper began. I hadn't believed in much beyond evidence and contracts for a long time, but an old neighbor, Mrs. Habib, who kept an altar of tiny things on her porch, said one night over tea, "Some things you can set in motion, and some things set themselves in motion. People like that leave footprints on the world." She pressed my hand. "Keep your eyes open." Her comment lodged in me. It wasn't a mystical plan. It was a warning that cruelty has a weight. It was also, strangely, a permission to listen for things that aren't on spreadsheets, rumors. The smell of resentment, the little accidents that reveal bigger truths. After that, oddities started to happen around them. Car alarms in the dead of night. Lights that flickered at precisely the wrong moment during a dinner party Margaret threw. Margaret, who never missed a photo op, started dropping plates she'd held for years. David's polished phone began to receive texts with wrong numbers and scolding voicemails about broken promises. No single incident proved anything. Together, they began to look like a pulse. I didn't orchestrate the supernatural. I made sure of that. I never tampered with their property. I never encouraged people to lie, but I did feed the atmosphere of unease. In one carefully staged moment, I invited a small circle of Lily's teachers to tea at a neutral cafe. I didn't say a single word about David or Margaret. I brought the printed evidence and let them read it. Their eyebrows rose. A woman who taught at David's old college emailed me privately later saying, "I thought he was ambitious." I didn't know he was. Calculating. The legal case moved forward. Depositions were arranged. Margaret was nervous. She's always been all surface, the right dress, the right casserole, the right memory for every anniversary. In the witness room, she seemed smaller. That was one of the first real wins. The woman who made other women feel inadequate, now forced to answer questions in a fluorescent room where her rehearsed lines didn't fit. But revenge isn't only about courtroom triumphs. It's also about watching the small world around you tilt. I arranged for a story carefully factual to reach a local columnist who loved family dramas. I supplied documents, signed affidavits, and offered anonymity. The reporter called. He came to my kitchen, asked about Lily, about the wedding, about the funeral anniversaries David never attended. I gave him a single phrase that cut through everything. He made home a brand. It was a sentence he liked. The column ran on a Saturday. David's name appeared next to adjectives like privileged and detached. Social media did the rest. His promotion stalled. Clients asked questions. Old friends sent condolences that weren't quite condolences. Margaret stopped volunteering at the charity she'd loved for years. Invitations slowed and then stopped. They were being peeled away slowly, like paint softened by years of neglect. But the real plan had a quieter center. I wanted the thing that had caused me the most pain to be reclaimed, Lily's trust. I started leaving little things for her, not grandiose gestures, but notes woven into the ordinary. A folded paper tucked into her book. Remember the night you learned to ride? You kept getting up. I saw you. I always see you. Small truths. They weren't legal or public. They were private tendons that needed to be rebuilt. At the same time, I planted a legal seed I knew they couldn't ignore. With my lawyer, I filed for equitable distribution and full financial disclosure. We requested audits. We named bank accounts and transactions in a way that made the auditors look twice. Discovery is a blunt instrument. It forces secrets into daylight, and daylight is a harsh disinfectant. As the discovery process began, so did the whispers in the firm and the community. David was called into meetings. Margaret's social calendar narrowed. Their private dinners were no longer private. There were always small hints that someone had spoken to someone else. The veneer cracked and hairline fractures. There were setbacks. A judge denied a motion we felt certain would pass. A witness backed away at the last minute, terrified of family fallout. I felt those losses like a physical ache. For a week, I considered folding. But then Lily would send me a photo of a sunrise she'd taken during an early class, and the stiffness in my chest softened into resolve. I began to notice something else, how easy it was for truth and hesitation to conspire against the arrogant. We all saw what we wanted to see. People who'd admired David suddenly remembered small slights. A business partner recalled unpaid invoices. A friend remembered a drunken confession. Each small recollection, trivial at the time, became a stitch in a net. I never celebrated. I didn't dance when Margaret's volunteer position evaporated. I didn't gloat when a client withdrew support. Instead, I kept my hands busy with the practical. Filings, phone calls, dinners with Lily where I listened more than I spoke. And yet, amid the legal documents and whispered allegations, the odd things continued. David began waking up to find his car scratched in the morning, a smear of mud on the passenger seat. He'd accuse neighbors of mischief. Margaret would rush to his side, worry threaded through her fake smile. I watched them flounder in private, their outward confidence flaking away like old varnish. I won't pretend I was unaffected by those scenes. There was a savage pleasure, yes, at the fairness of optics. The proud man reduced to a man who had to explain himself. But revenge had to be cleaner than petty satisfaction. It had to be irreversible. So I tightened the legal screws. Every document we filed, every witness we secured, every social tremor we set in motion fed into the same mechanism, unmasking. When David finally received a subpoena that named him in a formal investigation of financial improprieties at the firm, an investigation we had a hand in prompting through a carefully worded referral, he went silent. He'd spent years building a persona that never had to account. That silence was the sound of a man who'd lost the cheat codes. The plan had been long. It had cost me sleepless nights, weary glances, and the polite condescension of people who prefer harmony over justice. There were nights I sat awake imagining punishments worthy of the pain, public beatings, Ritual shaming, supernatural comeuppance. But in the end, the most effective revenge was the slow, relentless clearing of a ledger until what remained of them was what everyone could now see. Ordinary people who had made cruel, ordinary choices. I had become patient. I had become precise. And by the time the world began to notice the cracks I'd been chipping at for months, I was ready. The screen didn't come yet. Not then, but the stage was set. The audience was assembled. The lights were cold and unforgiving. All that remained was to wait for the final act to fall into place, the moment when the truth would become public and the people who'd mocked me would have to stand in front of everyone and explain themselves. I slept less. I smiled more carefully. I kept notes in the margins of my life. And I waited like someone who had finally learned how to sharpen a knife without cutting her own hand. I chose the night for its cruelty and its irony, the annual charity gala where Margaret had always shown perfect dresses, perfect speech, perfect hors d'oeuvres. She'd volunteered for years, not out of kindness, but because every applause fed her power. David was scheduled to be honored that evening with a Community Leadership Award. The invitation had his photo on it, smiling. The kind of smile he used when he wanted people to forget to look harder. I or SVPD as just a guest. I arrived early with Lily, who'd agreed to come only if I promised not to make a scene. I promised, and that promise was real. I had no intention of melodrama. I intended to end things the way I planned, quietly, with undeniable evidence and enough witnesses to make their defenses crumble. The room was a glittering sea of expectations. Margaret floated through it like she owned the night. David posed beside her for photographs, charming the donors who still believed in his brand. I stood at the back, Lily at my side, the folder of documents hidden beneath my coat like a thin, dangerous talisman. When they called his name for the award, the applause rose like a wave. David smiled, extended a hand, and climbed the stage. Margaret beamed from the front row as if she'd had a hand in planting every seed that made him look inevitable. I clapped. I let the rhythm of the room lull them into certainty. Then I spoke softly into the ear of the event organizer, a woman who'd been quietly sympathetic after reading the column. "Now," I said, "now would be a good time to announce the change in the program." She nodded. The microphone was transferred. The lights dimmed. For a breath, the world held. I walked to the stage, no dramatic pause. No raised voice. I took the microphone and said, "Thank you. I'd like to say a few words about honesty." People leaned forward because that's what polite people do when someone interrupts their ceremony. I didn't need to say much. I slid the folder onto the podium and set my phone beside it. The printed bank statements, the emails between David and Jessica, the transfers wired to Margaret's accounts, everything was there in neat stacks. I had copies for the press, for the organizers, and for Lily. I spoke slowly, as if reading a grocery list, and watched as comprehension spread through the audience. "I won't tell you my pain," I said. "You can read it yourselves." I tapped my phone. The room filled with the unmistakable tone of a notification, then a file playing. It was his voice, casual and cruel, recorded the night he bragged about keeping me quiet. The clip was short. "She's too broken to fight back," he'd said, laughing. The laughter in the recording cut like glass. The first gasp rolled through the crowd. The second came from Margaret. She reached for her handkerchief and left it clutched between white-knuckled fingers. David's face, which had been perfectly composed for years, went a color I'd only ever seen in flash photography, an ashen, unnatural hue. I let the evidence speak itself. I handed printed copies to the reporter seated near the front. I slid one across to the chair where a partner from David's firm sat, the man who'd privately confided his doubts months ago. I looked at Lily. Her eyes were huge but steady, her cheeks wet, but her chin lifted. She told me later that she needed to see proof, not hearsay. I'd given it to her. David rose. He tried to take the phone. He reached for the folder. His hands were not gentle. "You can't," he began, the words dying in his throat because they weren't true in a room full of papers and witnesses. He looked to Margaret for rescue. She only clutched at him as if her grip alone could keep the world from noticing. "You gave interviews saying you were the victim," I said, voice low and even. "You told strangers you were starting fresh while you'd been siphoning money for years. You told our daughter I was unstable. You left me to fend for myself and then expected me to applaud you when you took her future from under our roof." I let each sentence land. He started to scream, then not the short, angry outburst of a man who'd been caught but a raw animal sound made worse by how public it was. He screamed at me, at the organizers, at Margaret, at anyone who would listen. He flailed for control that had been stripped away by contracts, by audits, by the slowly accreting weight of truth, but the room held him. The reporters recorded. A board member quietly reached for his phone and dialed. The partner from the firm stood pale and asked David to step aside to speak privately. Someone from the gala's security called for calm. David's voice rose into a high hysterical pitch that made people look away. He was no longer the polished man who'd cut me off at the knees. He was a naked, panicked figure, stripped of performance. Margaret's mask cracked the moment people refused her excuses. She began apologizing, too late, too clumsy. Her volunteers drifted from her like leaves from a dying branch. One woman, someone Margaret had mentored, stood and walked out with a stack of pamphlets, her eyes burning with quiet betrayal. The club's president later told me she'd felt manipulated for years and finally saw the pattern. The security man who'd been there all night returned with 2 officers at his shoulder. They'd been called because of the firm's inquiry, because of a concerned donor who couldn't reconcile the man in the recording with the polished speaker they'd been honoring. When the officers asked if David would come with them to answer some questions, he screamed again, this time at the unfairness, at the persecution, at the fact that the stage he'd built was collapsing. It was not my scream that cut him. It was the sound of consequence. Papers shuffled. Phones clicked. Voices murmured into microphones. The man who had thought himself untouchable found his world, shrinking to the size of a courtroom in the back of a banquet hall. As they led him away, he kept screaming, wanting the audience to feel his hurt so they would forgive him. But the room had already heard the evidence. The applause that should have filled his ears was gone. Instead came the clink of silverware and a whisper of people rearranging their opinions. Lily reached for my hand. When the officers left, her fingers were warm. She squeezed, and I felt the long, slow stitch of healing begin. Margaret sat with her face in her hands, the image of triumph transmuted into disbelief. She would later write that night off as an unfortunate series of misunderstandings. Her credibility would never recover. When the last of the reporters left and the lights were dimmed for a sadder, quieter version of the evening, a single thing remained. The world now had a record. The legal machinery I'd set in motion would do the rest. But more than that, something I'd lost was returning my name. Spoken not in pity, but in truth. I didn't hear David's last screams over the sound of Lily's breathing, the small, steady proof of what mattered. He had wanted to humiliate me in front of her and failed. Instead, the humiliation had been redirected, focused, surgical, and final at him. He started screaming when I pressed play on a voicemail. He started screaming when a room full of people read the truth. He started screaming because he finally realized that the thing he had built his life on, image, control, the safety of other people's silence, had been quietly, irrevocably taken from him. And for the first time in years, I felt the sting of something clean, not pleasure, not triumph, but justice. The gala ended that night in a way no one expected. David left in handcuffs. Margaret was escorted out by two volunteers who had once idolized her. The organizers apologized to me privately, their voices hushed but sincere. They admitted they'd believed the version of me Margaret had painted, the broken, unstable wife who had driven David away. Now, with documents spread across their banquet tables, that illusion was gone. In the days that followed, everything unraveled for them. David's firm suspended him pending investigation, then quietly cut him loose when the evidence became too undeniable. Margaret's reputation in the community disintegrated. Her phone calls went unanswered, her committees voted her out, and her smiling face was scrubbed from newsletters. Jessica, the mistress he'd promised everything to, vanish the moment she realized she wouldn't be inheriting wealth, but inheriting lawsuits. I didn't need to lift a finger beyond that night. The revenge was already alive, fed by its own momentum. Every creditor, every partner, every reporter who picked up the story became another nail in the coffin of David's carefully built facade. And the beautiful, quiet part? I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't even gloat. The silence after the storm belonged to me, and it was enough. For Lily, it was more complicated. She struggled with the idea that her father had chosen image over her, that her grandmother had preferred lies to love. But as the weeks turned into months, she began to see that strength isn't loud, it's deliberate. She told me one evening while we were eating dinner together that watching him fall apart on that stage made her realize he'd never been the man she thought he was. And somehow that freed her. People often ask about revenge. Does it heal? Does it fix the wounds betrayal leaves behind? The truth is, it doesn't. My scars remain. My nights are still restless. But what revenge does, if done with precision, is return balance. It shifts the weight of suffering back where it belongs. It ensures the liar, the thief, the abuser cannot keep feasting off silence. When I stood at that podium, I wasn't just speaking for myself. I was speaking for every person who's been told they're too weak, too broken, too voiceless to fight back. And that, in the end, is the true revenge, to prove them wrong by existing in truth while their world burns in lies. So I'll leave you with this. If you were in my position, betrayed, humiliated, left for dead, would you stay silent? Or would you wait, plan, and strike when the world was watching? What would you have done in this situation?